My manager told HR it was just a system error. What he didn't know is that I had saved every single email since day one. So I scheduled a meeting with his boss. The number on his screen was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not rounding error wrong. Wrong by $12,000 on a bonus he had earned through 4 enterprise deals, 8 months of negotiation, and one Saturday he'd driven to a client's office in the suburbs because the man preferred face-to-face. Ethan Cole sat very still at his desk while the fluorescent lights hummed above him and Chicago pressed against the glass outside, and he did one thing before he did anything else. He opened his email archive. Every message, every date, every account. 3 years of a man believing that what was documented could not be denied. He was about to find out if he was right. The fluorescent lights in the Meridian Solutions office had a particular way of humming just loud enough to be annoying without ever being loud enough to complain about. Ethan Cole had learned to tune them out over 3 years of sitting at the same desk in the same open-plan floor, under the same pale light that made everyone look slightly ill. It was a Tuesday in late January, and Chicago outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was doing what Chicago always did in January, punishing anyone who dared to exist in it. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through even the heaviest coats, and the sky had settled into that particular shade of gray that suggested it had given up entirely on being anything else. Ethan didn't mind. He had something to look forward to. The Q4 performance bonuses were being processed that week. He knew because Sandra Whitfield from HR had sent a company-wide email the previous Friday, professionally worded, vague in the way HR emails always were, but clear enough in its meaning. Contributions from the final quarter would be recognized by end of business Wednesday. Ethan had read that email 3 times. Then he had opened the spreadsheet he kept privately on his personal laptop, not the company one, and reviewed his numbers. He had closed 4 enterprise accounts in Q4. 2 of them were clients that had been in negotiation for over 8 months, deals that his manager, Derek Hale, had personally told him were dead in the water back in October. Ethan had kept working them anyway. He had revised proposals, scheduled calls at 7 in the morning to accommodate clients in different time zones, and spent a Saturday in November driving to a client's office in Naperville because the man preferred face-to-face conversation and Ethan preferred closed deals. The total contract value of those 4 accounts was just over $2 million. The highest individual quarterly performance on the entire sales floor, a fact he knew because Nate Garrison, who sat 2 desks over and had a gift for finding information he wasn't supposed to have, had told him so with wide eyes and a low whistle 3 weeks ago. "Dude," Nate had said, leaning across the divider between their desks with the conspiratorial energy of someone delivering classified intelligence. "You know you're sitting at the top of the board, right? Like by a significant margin?" Ethan had shrugged, but he had felt something warm settle in his chest. Not arrogance. He wasn't built for arrogance. More like quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing the work was real, the effort was real, and the results were undeniable. The bonus structure at Meridian Solutions was tiered. Base salary was modest for Chicago's cost of living, but the performance bonuses were what kept people like Ethan from updating their LinkedIn profiles every 6 months. For a Q4 performance of his level, the projected bonus, according to the compensation document he had reviewed when he first joined the company, would fall somewhere between $14,000 and $18,000. He hadn't told anyone that number, not his girlfriend, not Nate. He had just let it exist quietly in the back of his mind, like a promise the company had made him through the sheer mathematics of effort and results. Wednesday arrived grey and cold, like all the others. Ethan checked his bank account at 8:47 a.m. from his phone under his desk, which he recognized was not his most professional moment, but felt entirely justified. Nothing yet. He checked again at noon. Still nothing. By 3 in the afternoon, a few people on the floor were quietly comparing notes, a particular kind of restless energy moving through the office, the way it always did on bonus day, people pretending to work while really waiting. At 3:22 p.m., his phone buzzed with a bank notification. A deposit had cleared. He opened the app, read the number, read it again. $2,200. He sat very still for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass. Nate was typing something across the divider. Everything was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago, and yet something had shifted fundamentally in the atmosphere of Ethan's Tuesday afternoon. He went back to the compensation document he had saved, not on the company drive, on his personal Google Drive, time-stamped from the day he'd first downloaded it 18 months ago. He checked the formula. He checked his sales numbers. He checked the bonus tier thresholds. The math was not ambiguous. The math was, in fact, insultingly clear. For his Q4 performance, the minimum bonus payout should have been $14,300. He had received $2,200. The difference was $12,100. He closed the app, opened his email, found the HR notification from Friday and read it again carefully, looking for language that might explain what had happened. A proration clause, a discretionary adjustment, anything. There was nothing. The email was as vague as it had always been. He scrolled through his inbox with the focused attention of a man who had just realized something was very wrong and needed to understand exactly how wrong it was before he said a single word to anyone. He found an email from Derek Hale, sent 2 weeks ago, that he had read at the time and filed without much thought. It was a routine-seeming message about Q4 account attribution adjustments, language so bureaucratic it had barely registered. He opened it now and read it with different eyes. Derek had written that following an internal review, certain accounts closed in Q4 would be reclassified under team contribution metrics to better reflect collaborative effort. The email was 4 sentences long. It had no specific names, no specific accounts, and no specific numbers. Ethan read it 4 times, then he opened a new folder in his personal email. He had long ago set up an automatic forward from his work account, a habit he'd developed not out of suspicion, but out of a general philosophy that important professional communications should exist somewhere he controlled. He began to search. He pulled up every email related to those 4 enterprise accounts, client correspondence, internal updates, proposal drafts, meeting confirmations. Each one had his name on it. Each one showed his work, his language, his effort, his timeline. He did not go to Derek's office that afternoon. He did not send an email. He did not say anything to Nate, who left at 5 with his coat half-buttoned, complaining about the cold and asking if Ethan wanted to grab drinks. Ethan said maybe next time. Instead, he stayed at his desk until the office had mostly emptied, the overhead lights dimming automatically as the motion sensors detected the absence of bodies. He opened a new document on his personal laptop and began to build a timeline. Every email, every date, every account, every number. By the time he shut the laptop at 7:15 p.m. and walked out into the brutal Chicago cold, Ethan Cole had a very clear picture of what had happened to his money. And he had every intention of getting it back. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office 12 minutes earlier than usual. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore. Dark slacks, a pressed button-down, no tie. But he had slept badly and made up for it with an extra cup of coffee from the place on Wacker Drive, where they actually knew how to make an Americano. He needed his mind sharp. He needed to move carefully. The strategy he had settled on somewhere around 2 a.m. To lying awake while the wind rattled his apartment windows on the north side was simple in its foundation. Say nothing. Learn everything, move only when the position was unassailable. He had watched enough people make the mistake of confronting too early, launching accusations with emotion and insufficient evidence, giving the other party time to construct a defense, to shift narratives, to paint the accuser as unstable or difficult. He was not going to make that mistake. Derek Hale arrived at 9:05, which was his habit, late enough to signal authority, early enough to maintain plausibility. He was a big man, physically, the kind who had probably played college football and never quite let go of the identity. He moved through the office with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 20 years being the most powerful person in whatever room he was in. He had a good handshake, a loud laugh, and a memory for the names of clients' children that Ethan had once found impressive and now found sinister in retrospect. "Cole," Derek said, passing Ethan's desk with his coffee in hand. "Good numbers last quarter. Team really pulled together." "Thanks," Ethan said. That was all. 2 syllables, neutral tone, eyes back on the screen. He watched Derek continue down the hall from his peripheral vision. The man did not slow down, did not look back. The casual ease of someone who had not considered for even a moment that there might be consequences. Ethan had already sent 2 emails that morning before Derek arrived. The first was to Sandra Whitfield in HR, marked as a routine inquiry. He had noticed what appeared to be a discrepancy in his Q4 bonus deposit and wanted to confirm that all account attributions had been processed correctly. Professional, calm, no accusation. The kind of email that created a paper trail without raising alarms. The second email was to himself, forwarded from his work account, containing Derek's message about Q4 account attribution adjustments, preserved with full headers and original timestamps. Sandra replied by mid-morning. Her message was apologetic in the way HR messages always were when they were buying time. Warm language, a promise to look into it, an assurance that these things sometimes took a day or 2 to sort through the system. She used the phrase system processing twice. Ethan noted the language. He responded with a simple thank you and asked her to let him know what she found. At lunch, he sat with Nate in the building's ground floor cafe, a place with good sandwiches and terrible acoustics that made private conversation easier than it should have been. "You good?" Nate asked, watching him with the perceptive attention of someone who had known Ethan long enough to notice when something was off. "You've been weird all morning." "Just tired," Ethan said. Nate studied him for a moment, then looked down at his sandwich. "Bonus hit yesterday." "Yeah. Mine was low. Like notably low." Nate said it carefully. "The way people say things they haven't fully decided to say yet." "I closed the Henderson account in November. That was mine. Solo. I have every email going back to August." Ethan looked at him. "How much did you get?" Nate told him the number. It was like Ethan's, significantly below what the compensation structure would have indicated. Not as dramatic a gap, but real. Something crystallized in Ethan's thinking. This was not a mistake. Mistakes happened to one person. Mistakes were isolated, explicable, correctable with an apology and a supplemental payment. What he was looking at was a pattern, which meant it was a decision. And decisions had architects. "Don't say anything yet," Ethan said quietly. Nate raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to know how many people this happened to before anyone says anything to anyone." Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way people nod when they understand that a situation is more serious than they initially assessed. "Okay," he said. "How do we do that?" "Carefully," Ethan said. "Over the next 2 days, working with the patient discretion of people who understood that the walls in open-plan offices were largely decorative, Ethan and Nate mapped the landscape. Nate had a social ease that Ethan lacked. He could ask questions that sounded like small talk, draw people into conversations without triggering defensiveness. What they found, assembled in fragments across lunch breaks and after-hours texts, was this. At least 4 other members of the sales team had received bonus payments that appeared inconsistent with their Q4 performance metrics. In each case, the shortfall could be traced, at least partially, to accounts that had been reclassified under Derek's team contribution adjustment. In each case, the reclassification had happened quietly, without individual notification, through a single bureaucratic email sent to the entire floor 2 weeks before bonus processing. On Friday afternoon, Sandra Whitfield stopped by Ethan's desk. She sat in the guest chair, crossed her ankles, and spoke in the careful tone of someone who had been coached on what to say. She told him that after reviewing the system, it appeared his bonus had been processed correctly, reflecting the account attribution adjustments that had been communicated to the team. She used the word communicated with a weight that suggested she believed it or was trying to. She told him that if he had further concerns, he was welcome to schedule a formal meeting. "That's fine," Ethan said pleasantly. "I appreciate you looking into it." After she left, he opened his personal laptop and added her visit to his timeline, noting the exact language she had used. Then he opened the original Derek email again and read the phrase, "communicated to the team," with the focused attention of a man building a case. That evening, he forwarded his entire organized file, emails, timeline, compensation document, account records, to his personal cloud storage. He created a second backup on an external drive he kept at home. He was not panicking. He was not angry, or at least he was managing the anger effectively, storing it somewhere useful rather than letting it burn through his judgment. He had something better than anger. He had documentation. The second week of February arrived with a brief, mocking thaw, 3 days where the temperature climbed above freezing, and Chicago briefly remembered that other weather conditions existed. Then it plunged again, and the city settled back into its grey endurance. Ethan had started walking to work instead of taking the L, using the 22 minutes to think clearly before the noise of the office closed in around him. He was beginning to understand the shape of the problem more completely, and the shape was not reassuring. Derek Hale had been at Meridian Solutions for 11 years. He had relationships with the executive team that predated most of the current staff. Carol Pennington, the executive director, had promoted him to regional sales manager 4 years ago, and by all observable evidence considered him one of her reliable pillars. He golfed with the VP of operations. His assistant had worked for him for 7 years. He was, in the architecture of the company, load-bearing. Ethan was 31 years old, with 3 years at the company and a good performance record. He understood perfectly well what that disparity meant in terms of institutional credibility. The thought arrived one morning during his walk, cold and clarifying. What if no one believes me? He had the emails, he had the numbers, he had the timeline, but documentation, he was coming to understand, was not the same as power. Documentation was potential. It required someone with the authority and the willingness to act on it. And that person had to believe that acting was worth the disruption. Organizations had a gravitational pull toward stability, toward protecting the structures that kept them functioning. A sales manager with 11 years of relationships was a structure. A sales rep with 3 years and a spreadsheet was a disruption. He shared this concern with Nate one afternoon, walking 2 blocks from the office to a coffee shop where the ambient noise provided cover. Nate listened with his hands wrapped around a paper cup and his expression doing the thing it did when he was processing something uncomfortable. "You're not wrong," Nate said. "Derek is basically untouchable in that building." "Not untouchable," Ethan said. "Protected. Those are different things." "What's the difference practically?" "Protection depends on the protectors not knowing what he did. Untouchable means they know and don't care." He paused. "I don't think Carol Pennington knows. And I don't think she's the kind of person who would be fine with it if she did." Nate considered this. "You're betting a lot on that." "I'm not betting anything yet. I'm still building." But the doubt was there, and it had texture. At night, in the apartment on the north side, he found himself running scenarios he didn't want to run. What if he brought the documentation forward and Derek produced a counter-narrative? System irregularities, miscommunications, good faith adjustments. What if the company's first instinct was to close ranks? What if formal process turned out to mean an investigation conducted by people who reported to the same VP Derek golfed with? He had seen it happen before, at a previous job, to someone else. A person had raised a legitimate concern through proper channels and had found themselves 6 months later managed out with a carefully worded severance agreement and a non-disparagement clause. The concern had been real. The outcome had still been what it was. The third week of February brought a development he hadn't anticipated. Derek called a team meeting, routine in its framing, Q1 pipeline review, nothing unusual on the surface. But 20 minutes in, he introduced what he called a revised account ownership protocol, a new system for logging and attributing client relationships that would, he explained with a broad and confident smile, create more clarity around team contributions going forward. Ethan watched the faces around the table. Some people were nodding, some were carefully neutral. Nate had his pen cap in his mouth and his eyes on the table. The new protocol, as Derek described it, would require all client communications to be logged through a centralized team inbox rather than individual accounts. Moving forward, account attribution would be determined by the manager's assessment of contribution weighting rather than individual metrics. It was, Ethan recognized with absolute clarity, a system designed to prevent what he had already documented from being documented again. Derek wasn't covering his tracks on the past. The past was already done. He was covering his tracks on the future, which meant he was planning to do it again. After the meeting, walking back to his desk with the careful calm he had been practicing for 3 weeks, Ethan made a decision. The timeline of patience had an endpoint. He could feel it now. That evening, he did something he had been deliberating for 2 weeks. He contacted an employment attorney, not to file anything, not yet, just to understand what he had, what it meant, and what the options were. The attorney, a woman named Rachel Finch, who had an office in the Loop and a reputation Ethan had researched carefully, agreed to a consultation the following Thursday. He didn't tell Nate. He didn't tell anyone. He walked home in the dark, the wind coming off the lake with its usual indifference, and he felt the fear and the resolve in approximately equal measure, which, he had learned, was usually what being right felt like when the situation was genuinely difficult. The Thursday consultation with Rachel Finch lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes. She had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had heard many things and was no longer surprised by any of them, which Ethan found immediately reassuring. She reviewed his documentation with the systematic attention of a person accustomed to separating what mattered from what didn't. She asked precise questions. She did not perform outrage or sympathy. She just worked through the material with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, occasionally making a note, occasionally asking him to clarify a date or a phrase. At the end of the review, she set down the pencil and looked at him directly. "This is well documented," she said, "better than most of what I see." "Is it enough?" She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that contained actual thought rather than performed hesitation. For a formal wage claim, potentially yes. The bonus structure is contractually referenced in your compensation agreement. The reclassification appears to have been applied without individual consent or adequate disclosure, and you have a clear paper trail showing your individual contribution to the affected accounts. She paused. "If others experience the same and you have evidence suggesting a pattern, that strengthens it considerably. What about going to the company internally first?" "That's usually the recommended path before anything external," she said. It creates a record. It gives the company opportunity to remedy the situation voluntarily. And if they fail to do so or retaliate, it substantially improves your position. She looked at him steadily. But you need to go to the right level, not your direct manager, not someone who reports to your direct manager. You need to go to someone with both the authority and the independence to act. The executive director, Ethan said, or above her if there's a board or a parent company with an ethics function. She slid a card across the desk. Either way, when you go in with the full documentation, organized and time-stamped, and you present it as a factual matter, not an accusation, not a grievance, a factual discrepancy with supporting evidence. You let the material do the emotional work. He left her office at 5:45 and walked through the loop in the early dark, the city lit up around him with the indifferent brightness of a place that had seen everything and would continue seeing it. He stopped at a corner on Michigan Avenue, the wind off the lake pressing against him with its usual insistence, and he stood there for a full minute, just breathing. Then he went home and spent the weekend building the presentation. It took him 11 hours across Saturday and Sunday. He organized everything chronologically, then by account, then by the delta between expected and actual compensation for each affected team member. He included screenshots of the compensation structure document, cross-referenced against Derek's reclassification email, cross-referenced against the actual bonus payments. He included his own case as the clearest and most fully documented, but structured it within the broader pattern. 5 employees, 4 accounts reclassified, a total bonus shortfall that, when he added it up carefully, exceeded $47,000 across the team. He read it through 3 times. He removed every emotional word, every instance of unfair, deliberately, scheme, gone. He let the numbers speak. Numbers, he had come to believe, were the most devastating language available because they required no interpretation and permitted no argument about tone. Monday morning, he arrived at Meridian Solutions at his usual time. He sat at his desk. He answered emails. He took a call with a potential client in the eastern suburbs. At 10:30, he sent a calm, formally worded email to Carol Pennington's assistant, requesting a brief meeting at Carol's earliest convenience regarding a compensation matter he'd like to bring to her attention directly. Carol's assistant replied within the hour. Carol had availability Thursday at 2 p.m. He confirmed the meeting. Nate appeared at his desk at lunch, reading his expression with the accuracy of someone who had been watching it for weeks. "Something's happening," Nate said. It was not a question. "Thursday," Ethan said quietly. "I need you to be available Thursday afternoon, not for anything public. I may need to confirm something with you after a meeting." Nate was still for a moment. Then slowly, "You're going to her." "Yes. Derek is going to—" "I know," Ethan said. "I've thought about every version of what Derek might do. I have documentation for every version." Nate looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, something that might have been admiration, or might have been fear on Ethan's behalf, or might have been both. "Okay," he said. "I'll be here." Thursday afternoon at 1:58, Ethan took the elevator to the executive floor with a printed copy of his documentation in a plain manila folder and the digital version on a USB drive in his jacket pocket. His pulse was elevated. He acknowledged this fact to himself and set it aside. Carol Pennington's office had a view of the lake that on clear days must have been extraordinary. Today the lake was a flat, dull pewter under a February sky, and the view was more endurance than beauty, which felt somehow appropriate. Carol was a precise, attentive woman who had built a mid-sized consulting firm through apparent force of competence and detail orientation. She gestured for Ethan to sit, asked her assistant to hold her calls, and looked at him with the calm of someone accustomed to managing complexity. "Ethan," she said, "what can I do for you?" He set the folder on the desk. "I want to walk you through something," he said, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to present it completely before we discuss it." She nodded. "Go ahead." He talked for 17 minutes. He did not rush. He used the documentation as he'd practiced. Factual, chronological, precise. He showed her the compensation structure. He showed her his account records. He showed her Derek's email. He showed her the bonus payment. He showed her the gap. Then he showed her the same analysis for 4 other team members. And he showed her the new account ownership protocol Derek had introduced at the February team meeting, the system designed to prevent future documentation of the same pattern. When he finished, Carol Pennington was quiet. She looked at the documentation on her desk with the expression of someone recalculating something important. The silence lasted long enough that Ethan had to consciously prevent himself from filling it. Finally, she said, "How long have you been building this?" "Since the day the bonus posted," he said. She looked at him directly. "And you came to me first?" "Not to HR, not to—" "I went to HR first," he said. "Sandra Whitfield told me the bonus had been processed correctly per the account attribution adjustments." He slid the email chain from Sandra across the desk. "I have that correspondence here." Carol picked it up, read it, set it down. "Leave this with me," she said. Her voice was even, controlled, but something had changed in it. A particular quality of stillness that Ethan recognized as someone containing a significant reaction. "I'll need 48 hours. "Of course," he said. He took the elevator back down to the sales floor, sat at his desk, and began answering emails. His hands were steady. His face was neutral. Across the floor, Derek was on a call, leaning back in his chair with his usual expansive ease. Ethan did not look at him. He had said everything he needed to say, and he had said it to exactly the right person. What happened next was no longer in his hands, but for the first time in weeks, that felt like relief rather than vulnerability. The 48 hours Carol Pennington had requested became 72. Long enough that Ethan's carefully maintained calm began to develop small fissures around the edges. By Friday afternoon, with no word from the executive floor, he found himself checking his email with a frequency he recognized as counterproductive. Nate had asked twice what was happening. Ethan had said both times that they were waiting. The weekend was slow and heavy. He ran along the lakefront path on Saturday, which was unusual for February, but the temperature had climbed to 38 degrees, and the path was mostly clear, and he needed to move, needed to remind his body that it was capable of effort and forward motion. He ran farther than he intended, past Montrose, into the quieter sections of the north lakefront where the path curved away from the road, and the city felt briefly distant. His breath clouded in the cold air. The lake was grey and enormous and indifferent, as it always was, and somehow that helped. On Sunday evening, he received an email from Carol's assistant. Carol would like to meet with him Monday morning at 9. "Please confirm attendance." He confirmed. He did not sleep particularly well Sunday night. Monday at 9, the executive floor was quieter than his previous visit. Carol Pennington was at her desk when he arrived, and this time there was a second person in the room. A man Ethan didn't recognize, introduced as Paul Garrett, from the parent company's internal compliance office. He had flown in from the company's headquarters in Atlanta. He was in his mid-50s, wore a good suit, and had the quietly authoritative manner of someone who dealt with institutional problems for a living. Ethan sat down. His folder was still on Carol's desk, undisturbed. Carol spoke first. "We've spent the last 3 days reviewing the documentation you provided, along with records from our internal systems." She paused. "The picture that emerged is consistent with what you presented." Ethan kept his face neutral. "Okay," he said. Paul Garrett spoke then. His voice was measured, precise. "Across the Q4 period, bonus allocations for 5 members of the Chicago sales team were affected by account attribution adjustments that were not consistent with our compensation policy." He looked at Ethan steadily. The adjustments were made by the regional sales manager without authorization from this level and without compliance review. That's a significant policy violation. What happens now? Ethan asked. Carol took that question. Derek Hale has been placed on administrative leave as of this morning, pending a full internal investigation. She said it the way people say things that are final, without drama, without softening, just the fact itself. All 5 affected team members will receive corrected bonus payments with applicable interest by end of this week. HR will be in contact individually to review each case and confirm the corrected figures. The number, when it landed, was $14,300, the minimum his documentation had projected, plus a small interest adjustment. The company would also be conducting a review of Derek's account attribution practices going back 18 months to determine whether prior quarters had been similarly affected. Ethan sat with that for a moment. "I want to ask you something," Carol said, and her tone shifted slightly. Less formal, more direct. "You held this for 3 weeks. You built the documentation before you said a word. Why didn't you come to me sooner?" He thought about the honest answer, and then he gave it. "Because I needed to be certain. Not just certain that I was right. I was certain of that relatively quickly, but certain that I had documented it in a way that couldn't be dismissed. That required a level of completeness that took time." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "That was good judgment." Paul Garrett walked him through the next steps. The formal written confirmation he would receive, the timeline for the corrected payment, the confidentiality expectations around the ongoing investigation. He was thorough and professional, and Ethan listened carefully and asked the questions that needed asking. When it was over, Ethan took the elevator back to the sales floor. The first thing he noticed was that Derek's office, the glass-walled corner space that had always had a slightly theatrical quality, the kind of office that said power through spatial arrangement, was dark. The door was closed. There was no coat on the hook behind the door, no coffee cup on the desk, no particular evidence that the room had been occupied that morning. He sat at his desk. He opened his email. He had 3 client follow-ups to write and a proposal due by end of week. He started with the proposal. Nate appeared at his elbow at 10:15, radiating a particular energy that suggested he had heard something and was working very hard to look like he hadn't. "So," Nate said with elaborate casualness. Ethan looked at him. "You're going to get an email from HR this week." Nate blinked. "About?" "Your Q4 bonus. There was a calculation error." Nate stared at him. "A calculation error?" "Yes. And Derek is on leave," Ethan said. "Administrative." The silence that followed had several layers to it. Nate sat down heavily in the guest chair and looked at Ethan with an expression that cycled through several things before settling on something that was mostly respect. "You actually did it," he said. "We documented it," Ethan said. "That's all." "That is genuinely not all," Nate said. Ethan turned back to his screen. "It's mostly all." The corrected payment arrived on Thursday, exactly as promised. He checked his phone at 8:47 a.m. At the same time, he had checked it on the Wednesday 5 weeks ago when the wrong number had appeared, and this time the right number was there, clean and real, and arrived through process rather than luck. He put his phone away and went back to work. In the weeks that followed, the office adjusted to Derek's absence with the particular efficiency of places that have survived disruptions before. A temporary regional manager was brought in from the St. Louis office, a woman named Patricia Oland, who had a business-like manner and asked direct questions and seemed to have no interest whatsoever in claiming credit for other people's work. The internal investigation ran its course. 2 other quarters were found to have similar irregularities. The full scope of what Derek had done when assembled across 18 months was considerably larger than Ethan's initial documentation had suggested. Ethan was not involved in that investigation. He provided his documentation when asked, answered questions when asked, and otherwise did his job. He closed 2 more enterprise accounts in February. He started Q1 with the highest pipeline on the floor, a fact he noted with the same quiet satisfaction he always felt when the work was real. One afternoon in March, on a day when the temperature had climbed to 52 and the city was doing its tentative, unconvinced version of considering spring, Ethan walked to lunch alone, taking the long way around the block just to be outside for a few extra minutes. He passed the coffee shop on Wacker, the cafe in the building lobby, the corner where he had stood on Michigan Avenue in February dark and made his decision to keep building. He thought about what the experience had taught him, not the dramatic lesson, not the tidy moral, but the practical, unglamorous thing he had actually learned. It was this: in environments where power is concentrated and informal, the only currency that matters is documentation. Not relationships, not performance, not being right, documentation, the patient, systematic, undramatic accumulation of evidence that transforms a personal grievance into an institutional reality. He had been patient. He had been systematic. He had let the emails do what emotions couldn't. He bought a coffee, walked back to the office, and spent the afternoon writing proposals. Outside, Chicago was deciding with characteristic reluctance whether to let spring arrive.